Elijah stood at the entrance of the gallery, a modest black canvas portfolio clutched tightly in his hand. He'd walked past this place more times than he could count, hoping that one day, someone would notice him, notice his work. The gallery was an institution in the city, a prestigious establishment where only the finest artists had their works displayed. The kind of place where the walls seemed to radiate wealth and exclusivity. Elijah wasn't sure what he was expecting when he walked through those glass doors, but he knew this was his chance. He had to make it count. The doorbell chimed softly as Elijah stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faintest trace of expensive perfumes. The walls, painted a pristine white, displayed works of art that were undeniably beautiful, but also distant, sophisticated pieces that spoke of an elite world Elijah didn't quite belong to. He felt the cold stare of the receptionist as she glanced up from her desk, her expression neutral, before her eyes slid back to her phone. Elijah moved past her without saying a word. His eyes were fixed on the expansive space ahead, where the main exhibit was being prepared for the evening's event. The gallery owner, Richard, was a man who carried himself with an aura of authority, someone whose presence commanded respect. He was tall, his neatly combed silver hair adding to the air of distinction. He wore an expensive suit, the kind that seemed to be tailored to perfection, and moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as he oversaw the final touches on the upcoming exhibition. Richard didn't notice Elijah at first, too absorbed in overseeing the installation of a piece by an artist whose name was known to anyone with even a passing interest in art. But Elijah didn't need to be noticed. He only needed a chance. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He made his way slowly through the space, glancing at the paintings as he went. Each one felt like a distant star, beautiful, radiant, but beyond his reach. As he approached the back of the room, where Richard was inspecting a sculpture, his heart began to beat faster. This was it. He could feel the weight of the opportunity settling on his shoulders. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his voice calm but carrying an air of quiet determination. Richard turned, momentarily surprised by the interruption. His sharp gaze scanned Elijah from head to toe, taking in the worn-out jeans, the simple t-shirt, and the beat-up sneakers that had seen better days. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling slightly at the corners in what could almost be described as a smirk. "Yes?" Richard asked, his tone clipped and dismissive. Elijah swallowed, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He'd been to plenty of galleries before, plenty of people had dismissed him before, but this was different. This was Richard, the owner of this prestigious gallery. The man who controlled the fate of many artists, the one who made or broke careers with a single judgment. "I'm an artist," Elijah said, holding up his portfolio, "and I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a look at my work. I'd love to be considered for your next exhibition." Richard's eyes flicked to the portfolio and then back to Elijah, his gaze uninterested. Another one," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Elijah to hear. The words stung, but Elijah pressed on. "I promise you won't be disappointed." "My work," Elijah hesitated but then straightened his back, the weight of his ambition pushing him forward, "my work is unlike anything you've seen before. It speaks to something real." Richard chuckled, a sound that held no warmth. "Real? I highly doubt that," he said, leaning back against the marble counter and crossing his arms. "I've seen thousands of portfolios, young man. I don't have time for pretenders." Elijah felt the sharp sting of his words, but he refused to be deterred. He opened the portfolio slowly, revealing the first piece, an abstract painting filled with bold, violent strokes of color, swirling around a central, almost chaotic focal point. It was raw, unrefined, yet powerful. He'd spent weeks on it, pouring every ounce of emotion and experience into it. To him, it was a statement about the struggles of the world around him, about power, poverty, and identity, but he knew it wasn't just a painting. It was part of who he was. Richard's eyes glanced at the piece, then slid away, as if it had no importance. He tilted his head slightly, as if examining the color and form, but there was no real engagement. His gaze flicked briefly to the corner of the room where the exhibition was being set up, then back at Elijah with a bored expression. "What is this?" Richard asked flatly. "A child could make this. There's nothing here that screams art, it's just paint slathered on a canvas. Perhaps you should consider a different career. Art isn't for everyone." Elijah's chest tightened. He had expected rejection, but the coldness of Richard's words hit harder than anything he had imagined. He'd prepared himself for disappointment, but he had hoped for more, a spark of interest, maybe even curiosity. Instead, he was met with disdain. Richard continued, his tone patronizing. "Look, I'm sure you're very talented in whatever it is you do, but this isn't what we showcase here. Maybe try something more conventional. Something that doesn't look like it was made in an art class by a beginner." The words burned through Elijah's mind. He had known that this wasn't going to be easy, but to be so blatantly dismissed like that, it stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. He closed the portfolio slowly, the edges of his vision beginning to blur as a wave of frustration and self-doubt crept in. "I see," Elijah said quietly, his voice just above a whisper, trying to mask the hurt. "Thank you for your time." Richard barely acknowledged the dismissal. He turned back to the exhibition, already moving on to the next piece of art, as if Elijah's presence had been nothing more than a passing annoyance. Elijah stood there for a moment longer, staring at the closed portfolio in his hands. He wanted to leave, wanted to storm out of the gallery and never return. But something inside him stopped him. He had come this far. He couldn't just give up now. He wasn't going to let one man's rejection define him. With a deep breath, he turned and walked out of the gallery, the weight of his portfolio suddenly feeling heavier than it had ever before. As he stepped back into the bustling street outside, he looked around at the world, at the people who walked by, oblivious to the inner turmoil he was fighting through. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The rejection had stung, but it also ignited something inside him, a fire he hadn't realized he had. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Elijah walked out of the gallery, feeling a hollow emptiness wash over him as he stepped into the noisy street. The cool air hit his face, but it didn't offer any comfort. He stood there for a moment, the hum of the city around him, yet he felt completely disconnected, as though he were floating above it all, watching it from a distance. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the portfolio, the rejection still raw in his mind. The words Richard had spoken echoed in his head, "This isn't what we showcase here. Maybe try something more conventional." The sting was worse than he had anticipated. The gallery owner hadn't just rejected his art, he had rejected him. And Elijah had known, deep down, that this was how it would go. He'd seen it time and time again, both in the art world and in life. People like Richard only saw value in what fit into their narrow, privileged perspectives. But this wasn't the end. Elijah wasn't ready to give up yet. He had poured his soul into that painting, and he knew it wasn't just some beginner's mistake. There was power in it. There was truth in it. And no matter how much Richard had mocked it, Elijah wasn't going to let that truth be silenced. He had to keep going. That night, Elijah sat at his tiny desk in his cramped apartment, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the walls filled with unfinished works. He could feel the weight of Richard's rejection pressing against him, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he let it fuel him. Every dismissive word, every patronizing glance, became a spark for his next move. Elijah had always been the type to work harder when others doubted him, and Richard had done nothing but give him more reason to prove his worth. He began working feverishly, not on new pieces of art, but on his plan. Elijah had grown up in a neighborhood where hope wasn't something handed to you on a silver platter. You had to fight for it, claw your way up, and hold on to what little you could find. And that's exactly what Elijah was going to do. He wasn't going to wait for Richard or anyone else to hand him an opportunity. He was going to find his own. He spent the next few weeks in complete solitude, away from the distractions of the world. He didn't just work on his art, he researched. He researched the art world's history of undervaluing black artists. He learned about auctions, about private collectors, about galleries that specialized in contemporary black art. He pored over books, interviews, and online forums. What he discovered was astonishing. Hidden from the public eye was a booming market for black artists, one that was frequently overlooked by the mainstream art world. Elijah realized there was a thriving underground movement where people like him, artists who weren't given the chance by traditional spaces, could find their place. It wasn't long before he stumbled across a pivotal moment. He discovered that one of his paintings, a piece he had sold quietly through a friend, had been resold at a private auction for an amount that made his stomach drop. The painting, which he had sold for just a few $100s, had now fetched millions. He had heard of these auctions, but never imagined his own work would be part of such an event. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His art had value. More than Richard's dismissive words could ever have imagined. Elijah wasn't some unknown artist anymore. He was part of a movement. But he knew that the art world had its own rules, and those rules didn't favor someone like him, someone without connections or legacy. They favored the wealthy, the elite, the ones who could afford to buy their way into the conversation. Still, Elijah felt a new sense of purpose rise within him. He wasn't just a painter anymore. He was a force that would change the conversation. He began to see himself not just as an artist, but as someone who could challenge the very institutions that had rejected him. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If the world wasn't ready for his art, then he would make the world ready. His plan began to take shape. Elijah had a small savings account, just enough to get by for a few months. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. So, he used that time to learn everything he could about gallery exhibitions, about the buying and selling of art, about collectors who might see his value even if the gatekeepers of the art world wouldn't. He attended underground auctions, met with buyers, and found hidden networks that bypassed the usual art world establishment. Elijah wasn't just going to be a passive player in this system, he was going to change the rules entirely. But the path forward was far from simple. Elijah still had to deal with the more immediate problem, Richard. The gallery owner hadn't just dismissed him once, he had become a symbol of the art world's deep-seated biases. Richard wasn't just a gatekeeper, he was part of the problem. And Elijah couldn't let that slide. One evening, as he was walking through the city after a long day of research and planning, Elijah received an unexpected message. It was from an art collector, someone who had seen one of his pieces at a private showing and wanted to discuss purchasing more of his work. The collector was connected to some of the top auction houses, and they had a growing interest in black contemporary artists. Elijah's heart raced as he read the message over and over again. It was happening. Slowly, but surely, Elijah was building momentum. The underground networks were beginning to notice him. People were beginning to understand the value of his work in a way that the mainstream art world, represented by people like Richard, had failed to see. As Elijah sat down to respond to the collector, he realized something important. This wasn't just about selling his art. This was about changing the way art was viewed, about making a statement not only with his brushstrokes, but with his actions. He had already made the first step. He had already proven to himself that his art had value. And now, he was going to prove it to everyone else. The days blurred together in a constant flurry of work and planning. Elijah's mind was alive with possibilities, strategies, and, most of all, determination. The rejection from Richard and the endless doubts had fueled him like a fire, pushing him to research every angle, every opportunity that could help him make his mark. And now, just a few weeks later, it felt like everything was slowly starting to fall into place. It wasn't just the art world that Elijah was learning about, it was the people within it. He had begun connecting with a small, but growing, group of art collectors who saw the value in black artists, those who, like him, had been overlooked by the mainstream galleries and auction houses. These collectors had an eye for work that challenged the status quo, for art that spoke to deeper truths, and they weren't afraid to bypass traditional channels to find it. One evening, Elijah received an invitation that sent a shiver of excitement through his entire body. A renowned private auction house wanted to feature one of his paintings in their upcoming event. The email was brief, but the offer was clear. They were willing to pay a substantial amount for his work, an amount that far exceeded anything he'd ever imagined. The truth of it hit him like a punch to the gut. His work, his art, was now considered valuable. Worth millions. But Elijah wasn't naive. He knew the game. The art world's hierarchy was built on reputation, on who you knew, and where your work was displayed. He had no gallery backing him, no network of influential patrons to push his work. All he had were his connections to the underground scene and a growing reputation within the smaller, more progressive circles that had started to take notice of his work. Despite this, the offer was real. His art had been noticed, and it was about to change everything. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what this moment meant. He had finally caught the attention of the right people, the kind of people who had the power to shift his career, to elevate him from an unknown artist to someone who could command respect. But even more than that, it was a realization: I don't need Richard's gallery. I don't need anyone who doesn't see my worth. He'd been mocked for so long, discounted as too raw or too unconventional, but this new opportunity was a testament to the fact that his work wasn't just valuable, it was necessary. The following week, Elijah made the decision to take a bold step forward. He would go to the auction, and he would witness firsthand what his art could bring. This wasn't just about selling a painting, it was about taking his place within the art world and proving that his voice, and the voices of artists like him, were not to be ignored. This was bigger than one piece of artwork. This was about validating his entire journey, his struggle, and his refusal to be silenced. The night of the auction arrived, and Elijah was a bundle of nerves, excitement, and anticipation. He donned his best attire, nothing too fancy, but enough to show that he was here for business. His hands were still a little sweaty as he walked into the grand building where the auction was being held. The space was opulent, filled with wealthy buyers who appeared to be in their own world, completely out of touch with the struggles of artists like Elijah. Yet, Elijah felt a strange calm as he took in the atmosphere. He belonged here, just as much as any of them. Elijah's painting was one of the first to be shown in the event. As the auctioneer introduced the piece, the room fell silent. He couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the air, an energy of curiosity, a shift in tone as his work was displayed before a room of some of the most powerful art buyers in the world. The moment was surreal, and Elijah allowed himself a single, fleeting moment to savor it. His work, the very painting Richard had scoffed at, was now a part of the conversation in a way that he had never imagined. The bidding began. The auctioneer's voice rang out as the price quickly climbed higher than Elijah had ever expected. He could hear the murmurs in the room, whispers about the artist and the piece, and the increasing tension as the bids raced upward. The painting, which had once been a personal piece of expression in Elijah's modest apartment, was now being treated as a commodity, a prized asset. The numbers on the screen beside the auctioneer kept rising, climbing past what Elijah had once believed was possible for his work. But the moment that truly changed everything came when one of the top buyers in the room, a renowned collector with decades of experience, placed the winning bid. The hammer fell, signaling the sale of Elijah's work for a staggering sum. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Elijah realized the full weight of what had just happened. His art was now worth millions. Elijah stood there, stunned. He had always believed in the value of his work, but to see it validated in this way, to watch the piece he had created, the one that Richard had dismissed so carelessly, be sold for an amount that could change his life forever, he was overwhelmed. But it wasn't just about the money. Elijah had proven something more profound that night. He had proven that he was more than the rejection he had faced, more than the judgment of people like Richard. He was an artist of significance, of importance. His voice, his vision, his identity, these things mattered, and the world was beginning to see them. After the auction, Elijah took a moment to step outside, away from the glittering lights of the building. The crisp night air felt refreshing against his skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he exhaled deeply. The weight of years of struggle, of being overlooked, felt lighter now. His art had made its statement. He had made his statement. As Elijah stood there in the stillness, he realized something: the world might not always understand him, but his art would speak for itself. The people who had dismissed him would soon have no choice but to listen. And then, a thought crossed his mind: Richard. The man who had mocked his work, who had underestimated him so completely. Elijah smiled softly to himself, already feeling the seeds of something bigger take root. This was only the beginning. Elijah stood on the steps of the auction house, still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. His heart was racing, a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. The painting he had poured his soul into had just sold for millions, far more than he had ever thought possible. The familiar hum of the city buzzed around him, but everything felt different now. The streets, the buildings, even the people seemed to shimmer with possibility. Elijah was no longer just an aspiring artist. He was someone to watch. But the truth was, even with the money and the recognition, Elijah still felt like an outsider. The world he was now a part of, the world of high-end galleries and private collectors, was not one he had ever belonged to. It was a world filled with exclusivity, an unspoken hierarchy that had little space for someone like him, a black artist who had fought for every inch of his place in the art world. He knew that, despite his success, the power structures of this world were not yet ready to embrace someone like him fully. Still, he had made a statement, and he wasn't about to let that fade into the background. Elijah knew that the next step in his journey wasn't just about proving his worth again, it was about changing the very institutions that had denied him, the ones that had dismissed his talent without ever seeing his full potential. As Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket, he saw a familiar name flash across the screen. It was Marcus, a friend and fellow artist who had always been in his corner. Marcus had witnessed Elijah's rise from the very beginning, and he knew better than anyone how hard Elijah had worked to get to this point. "Man, you did it," Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. "I heard about the auction. You're a legend now. What's next?" Elijah leaned against the brick wall, his thoughts racing. "I'm just getting started," he said with a grin that was half disbelief and half determination. "But I need to do more than just make a name for myself. I want to change the whole game, Marcus. I want to take the art world and flip it on its head." Marcus paused, and Elijah could practically hear the gears turning on the other end of the line. "What are you thinking?" "I'm going to open my own gallery," Elijah said, his voice firm. "Not just a gallery, though, a space where artists like me, artists who have been overlooked, can thrive. Where we can make our own rules and tell our own stories." There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. "That's bold, man. But I get it. You've been rejected by the gatekeepers long enough. I believe in you. If anyone can do it, it's you." Elijah could feel the weight of Marcus's words, a kind of validation that he hadn't expected but had longed for. This was more than just about his art now. It was about creating something that would challenge the status quo, create space for other artists like him who had been told time and time again that they weren't enough. Elijah had the chance to build something bigger than himself, a legacy that would last. He spent the next few weeks in a whirlwind of planning, meeting with other artists, and finding the right location for his gallery. It wasn't easy. The art world wasn't built for the kind of change Elijah wanted to bring. He had to convince investors and collectors that his vision was more than just a passing trend. It was a movement. A revolution. His goal wasn't just to sell art, it was to challenge the very way art was viewed and experienced. Finally, after months of hard work, Elijah opened the doors to his new gallery, Roots and Realities. The opening night was a star-studded event. Elijah had invited a mix of influential figures, those who had supported him and those who had previously dismissed him, along with a community of up-and-coming black artists whose work had been ignored by the mainstream. As the gallery doors opened to reveal a stunning collection of bold, groundbreaking works of art, Elijah felt a sense of pride wash over him. This wasn't just a gallery, it was a statement. The night was electric. The air was thick with anticipation as guests wandered through the gallery, pausing at each piece, murmuring among themselves. Elijah moved among the crowd, his eyes scanning the room, watching people interact with his work, and the work of the other artists he had championed. He saw rich patrons who had once only bought from the elite, now engaging with pieces that spoke to them on a deeper level, pieces that challenged their perceptions of art. He watched as critics, the very people who had once dismissed him, now found themselves in awe of what they were seeing. But it wasn't the wealthy buyers or the critics' praise that made Elijah's heart soar. It was the artists. It was seeing the other creators, those who had struggled in the same way he had, now having a platform to showcase their work. Elijah had built something that was about more than just him. It was about changing the narrative for artists of color, for those who had long been told their stories didn't matter. His gallery was a space where the art didn't have to fit into anyone else's mold. It could be bold, it could be real, and most importantly, it could tell the truth. As the evening wore on, Elijah stood at the front of the gallery, a soft smile on his face as he watched his vision come to life. His work had already made waves in the art world, but now it was time to build something permanent. He was no longer the rejected artist trying to prove himself. He was a force in the industry, a game changer, a person who had reshaped the conversation about art, about race, and about what it truly meant to be an artist. There was a fine line between remaining true to the gallery's mission and ensuring that it could survive in an art market that prized profit over purpose. He had spent countless nights wrestling with this dilemma, wondering if the very thing he had fought for, the recognition of marginalized voices, was becoming just another business venture. One evening, just days before the fair, Elijah met with his team, including Tasha, in the gallery's back office. The room was tense, charged with the energy of conflicting emotions. Elijah stood at the head of the table, looking at each of the artists gathered around him. There was a sense of unease in the air, everyone was on edge, worried about what was to come. "I know this fair means a lot to all of us," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm. "But we can't lose sight of why we're doing this. We're not just here to make money or gain fame. We're here to make a statement. Our art challenges the status quo, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this space." Tasha leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But Elijah, we're about to enter the very world we've been fighting against. These buyers, these critics, they're the ones who want us to conform, to fit into their narrow view of what art should be. I don't know if I can be part of that, knowing what it's become." Elijah nodded, understanding her fears. "I get it, Tasha. But we have to show them that we're not going to be boxed in. Our art isn't a commodity, it's a tool for change. And whether they want to accept it or not, that's what it is. We can't let them dictate our worth." The conversation continued late into the night, with emotions running high. There was a sense of uncertainty hanging over the gallery. But as the hours passed, a shared resolve began to form. They were all in this together, and whatever happened at the fair, they would stand united. It wasn't about winning the approval of the art elite, it was about staying true to their purpose. The day of the fair arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. The Roots and Realities booth was a stark contrast to the sleek, polished displays of the other galleries. While the other booths flaunted expensive, abstract works, Elijah's gallery was filled with pieces that told stories, stories of resistance, resilience, and the fight for justice. The space felt raw and unrefined, yet there was a power in its authenticity that made it stand out amidst the polished, commercialized artwork surrounding it. As the visitors filtered in, it quickly became clear that Roots and Realities was making an impression. People stopped, stared, and asked questions. They were drawn to the intensity of the work, the message that reverberated through each piece. But there was something else, a quiet hum of discomfort. Some of the art collectors and critics walked past with sneers, dismissing the pieces as too political or too radical. Others stood for longer, looking intently, trying to decipher the meaning behind the bold imagery. Charles Whitaker appeared at the fair as well, accompanied by his usual entourage of wealthy buyers and curators. He made his way through the exhibit, his eyes narrowing as he took in the artwork. Elijah watched him from across the room, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew that Charles would be critical, that he would attempt to undermine the entire premise of Roots and Realities. But Elijah didn't flinch. He had fought too hard to get here. Finally, Charles approached Elijah. There was a tense silence as they regarded one another. "Well, Elijah," Charles said with a smirk, "I see you've really gone all in with this. Quite the spectacle you've created here. But tell me, do you really believe this kind of work belongs in a place like this? I thought art was supposed to be timeless, not a political statement." Elijah stood his ground, his voice steady. "Art is always political, Charles. You just choose to ignore it when it doesn't fit your narrative. But the truth is, this is the art of the future. The art that challenges the world, that makes people uncomfortable. If that doesn't belong in this space, then maybe it's the space that needs to change." For a moment, there was a silence between them, thick with the weight of their differences. Charles said nothing, merely offering a curt nod before turning to leave. But Elijah didn't care about his approval anymore. He knew that Roots and Realities was more than just a gallery, it was a movement, a catalyst for change. As the fair continued, Elijah saw the shift. He saw new faces, people who had never been part of the established art world but who recognized the power of the work. These were the people who had been waiting for a place like Roots and Realities, a space where art could be more than just decoration. They saw it for what it was, a revolution. By the end of the fair, Roots and Realities had done more than survive, it had thrived. The gallery had made its mark, not just on the art world, but on the cultural landscape as a whole. Elijah had proven that he wasn't just an artist or a gallery owner, he was a force to be reckoned with. And as he stood amidst the crowd at the closing of the fair, he knew one thing for certain, the battle for the future of art was far from over. But Roots and Realities was ready. And Elijah was ready. The revolution was just beginning.